All right, welcome. Thank you all for being here to our 6th annual Philosophy of Religion Conference on our theme, Philosophy of Religion and the Environment. We've had a good day so far, just a couple of sessions, but they've been really good, a lot of good discussions so far, and we're looking forward to tomorrow as well. Remember, tomorrow our first session starts at 10, but we will also have donuts and coffee and snacks and all sorts of things that college students love. From about 9 o'clock, we'll have that set up around 9 o'clock, and we can kind of meet and have a bite for breakfast and chat for a bit before things get started. So hope you can make it out tomorrow as well. Just a couple of things. This conference was something that we started several years back. I got a small partner grant from the Society of Christian Philosophers and was able to put on a conference with matching friends from Baylor. From Weatherford. Sorry, I've been talking about my undergrad. From Weatherford, they matched funds, and after that, they continued to fund this. And we're in our 6th year of holding the conference. It's the 7th year since that first one because of the COVID kind of blip. So it's been a really great opportunity to kind of show you guys, students and visitors, what we can do at a community college to your level, to your college. We can add to this conversation that's taking place at big universities. There's nothing about what we're doing here that's in any way inferior to any other higher education. So it's an important place that we have and important things that we do, and that's part of what conferences like this, and the one we'll be having next week, to kind of plug that one a little bit. The one we'll be doing next week is also kind of right down there. Another thing about these lectures in particular, I've got a lot of thank yous on the page, so if you're not sure about the schedule, scan any of the QR codes, it takes you to the digital schedule. I got thank yous there. There's a lot of people here at Weatherford to thank, and I thank them all there, so please go and check out all the people who helped make this happen. Another quick note too about these lectures. We have, this is I think our 3rd year to have named these lectures in honor of Ben Arbor. Ben Arbor was an adjunct here at one time in 2020. Tragically, he and his wife were killed by streetcar racers. And Ben was a philosopher. He was he actually for a living, he sold cars. That's what he was, a used car salesman. But he, which I don't know, maybe that fits really well with philosophy. But he was a philosopher, a PhD philosopher who loved philosophy, but more than that, he loved people, and he loved having conversations, and he loved the discussions that these kinds of events bring about. So, as an honor to him, there's not much more we could do but honor him in this kind of way. We've named these lectures after him in the hopes that the kind of thing we're doing here to spark conversation, discussion, all of those things that Ben loved. He would have been here, to be honest. He was a big supporter of this event, and he would have been here right in the mix. He loved the papers, he loved the conferences, but he loved the discussions more. So I really hope that what we're doing here will generate that for you guys, all right? So, with that said, allow me to introduce Dr. Schwerin Rowe is Associate Professor in the Philosophy of Religion Department at University of North Texas. She received a PhD in Theological and Philosophical Studies from Drew University and is author of Toward a Better Worldliness, Ecology, Economy, and the Protestant Tradition, and of Modern Extraction, Experiments in Critical Petrotheology. Her current research focuses on imaginaries of matter and energy as they vitalize or obstruct capitalist extractivism. She is founding co-chair of the AAR Seminar on Energy, Extraction, and Religion, on the steering committee of the Academy's Religion and Ecology Unit, and a member of the Petrocultures Research Group. Other recent publications include essays on oil, religion, vitalism, and new materialisms, the matter of oil, extraction, vitalisms, and enchantment, oily animations, yeah, I said that right, oily animations on Protestantism and petroleum, eminent religiosities, new materialisms, and planetary thinking. That's where it was what it was in, that publication. So, she is presenting our first plenary session tonight on, let me get to it, Disenchantment and Domination, Rethinking Philosophy of Religion and Environment. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Trickett, for the invitation and for the opportunity to become part of this community. It's been really nice to see the way that this conference has contributed to such great scholarship, but also built what seems like a really lovely community around it. And so I'm really happy to be here. I've been invited to offer 2 lectures. So tonight I would like to give a sense of where I feel like the study of philosophy and religion and environment has been and where I think it needs to be going. And then tomorrow I'll give a more focused lecture, especially on energy and extraction and religion. But it'll pick up on some of the themes of enchantment and disenchantment that I'll focus on for tonight. So whether one traces the beginnings of the modern U.S. environmental movement to Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, or the Cuyahoga River Fire, the Santa Barbara oil spill, or earlier to John Muir or Emerson and Thoreau, is common to tell the story of environmentalism as a purely secular, even secularizing movement. We see the influence of this narrative in the current U.S. political climate, posing environmentalism as devoid or even antagonistic to religion, and resulting in a politically influential anti-environmental movement. Even in the ways the environmental movement itself is self-narrated, the role of religious or spiritual values, movements, or influences is often not highlighted. So as far apart as anti-environmentalism and environmentalism are, what they hold in common is a tendency to obscure or overlook the ways religious views have consistently been entangled with environmentalism and even environmental science. By contrast, philosophy of religion and environmental scholars, us in this room, have emphasized that even at the beginning of the ecological sciences, with Ernst Haeckel, who first coined the term, ecology was not a pure science, but part of a broader moral and spiritual worldview. Haeckel emphasized that better understanding organisms and their relationships and interdependencies was not just an empirical project, but a moral project with ethical aims to live better in the world with humans and other than humans. What's more, scholars have emphasized that the modern environmental movement was fully immersed in, even as Evan Berry has argued, had its roots in religion. And from another angle, scholars like Brett Malcolm Granger has emphasized that distinctive American religious movements like evangelicalism were profoundly influenced from the beginning and shaped in relation to natural environments and a sense of the immanent divine presence in nature. Too often, social concerns of environmental justice movement have been theorized apart from or as subcategories of or secondary to environmental philosophy. So social justice oftentimes kept apart from environmental justice. Yet the environmental justice movement in particular has significant ties to religion. The birth of the environmental justice movement is often traced to a 1982 protest in North Carolina over the decision to place a landfill that would collect soil contaminated with illegally dumped PCBs in an impoverished, predominantly black neighborhood in Warren County. A group of mothers from the neighborhood organized to block the construction of the site by laying their bodies on the road in front of the proposed site. Residents also reached out to the United Church of Christ, the UCC, and their Commission for Racial Justice, the CRJ, and its leader at the time, Reverend Ben Chavez. As the actions of citizens of North Carolina gained public attention, it became widely recognized that Warren County was not alone. Across the US, the UCC Commission for Racial Justice heard from communities inhabited predominantly by minoritized populations that they were suffering from health effects as a result of living in close proximity to toxic sites. In response, the CRJ commissioned and published the first study on the correlation between race and toxic waste sites in 1987, concluding that members of minority races in the US were more likely to live in close proximity to environmental toxins, a phenomena the study called environmental racism. Such entanglements, rather than antagonism between environmentalism and religion, will not come as a surprise to many of us, including anyone who is engaged in the field of religion environment. The field has now a decades-long rich history of scholarship on interlinkages, interconnections, and imbrications of religion and environmental practice. Today, I'd like to give some framing to those discourses, outlining key themes of debates, and suggest future directions needed in these fields. In short, I will emphasize a shift from an initial orientation around dominion debates to a current emphasis on and emerging debates around enchantment and disenchantment, and then argue for a new focus on extraction. The first stage of religion environmental discourses has been dominated what I call the dominion debates. The beginning of these debates is often traced to the publication of historian Lynn White Jr.'s infamous 1976 essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, a text many of us are familiar with. In that essay, he argues that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen, and traces this to its particular interpretation of Genesis' creation narrative, where humanity is given a divine mandate to have dominion over all the earth. White's claims sparked a flurry of scholarly responses, ranging from affirmation to rejection and condemnation of poor biblical hermeneutics and a lack of scholarly support, to assessments that although White's biblical interpretation might have some flaws, the gist of his argument nevertheless holds and therefore calls for adjustments or revision within the tradition itself. Given White's contentious thesis and the energetic responses to it, most narratives, and indeed philosophy of religion and environment syllabi, began with White's thesis and subsequent dominion debates. However, I think White's thesis and the dominion debates that followed are merely one example of many different ways of characterizing the environmental problem as an issue of disenchantment. I suggest that the dominion debates were grounded in even wider discussions that extended beyond the field of religion and environment about the role of modernity, modern epistemologies, modern science, and globalized capitalism in disenchanting the world. White's argument itself displays this framing. In addition to focusing on the interpretations of dominion passages of Genesis, he emphasizes that the historic roots of the current environmental crisis are due to a loss of animist enchantments in trees, plants, and animals, resulting in the kinds of logics that allowed then current Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, to argue against environmental protection because, quote, when you've seen one redwood tree, you've seen them all.
Oh, wow.
In this case, with the other early voices in the field, and in this case, and this is the case with other early voices in the field. Anticipating White by more than a decade, Joseph Sittler, for example, emphasized a loss of divinity and grace in nature, leading to a conjoined spiritual and environmental crisis based on a shared loss of meaning. Thomas Berry is most well known for arguing that a deep understanding of the history of the evolving universe is necessary for guiding meaning and morals today. He emphasized that a, quote, old story of Western religion had lost its current power in modernity and has generally led to a sense of fear, distrust, and profound aversion to the earth and its processes. Consequently, Berry calls for a new story that integrates science with meaning-making narratives of spirituality and religion to provide a shared set of meaning and morals that can guide people and societies in modernity. Similarly, Hans Jonas theorizes that the crisis of modern humans as he theorizes the crisis of modern humanity as resulting from the vacuum, the quote, great nothing that philosophy offers for questions about how we should live, because both philosophy and religion have given way to science. He argues the human relation to nature in modernity as disenchanted and, quote, purposeless, because a lack of value in divinity leaves humanity as the, quote, sole repository of intentions and ends for nature. This results in a situation where technology creates a power that has to be exercised in a, quote, vacuum of norms. And more recently, Saeed Hossein Nasir emphasizes that modern science and religion secularization has removed knowledge of the natural world from sacred meaning, leading to a loss of value in the natural world as well as a shared structure of morals or ethics for engaging with the other than human world. What these early and influential voices of philosophy, religion, and nature share is a shared sense that environmental destruction is rooted in a moral, spiritual, religious vacuum that modern science, epistemology, and subjectivity have introduced. What they share, in other words, is a sense of environmental destruction rooted in a current state of disenchantment. This is a term introduced by Max Weber in a lecture on the vocation of science in 1918. The term literally means demagication, and it conveys a sense that the advent of scientific methods and the use of enlightened reason have led to a loss of magic or mystery in nature, which has corresponded with a sense of ownership or control over it. Significantly, the disenchantment that Weber identifies is something he sees as mournable but necessary. It's something akin to what many of us might today describe as adulting. It was sometimes wondrous to look at the world as if it was filled with magic, but once we came of age, we need to see things realistically. Therefore, disenchantment for Weber is necessary, but also something to be mourned. In certain instances, disenchantment is explicitly linked to themes of dominion or domination, even beyond the discourses of religion and environment. For example, according to ecofeminists like Carolyn Merchant, domination of nature is linked to the domination of feminized humans. Merchant narrates the story of modern science as a shift from ancient nature metaphors that encompassed a limiting ethic on human engagements with nature to a modern view of nature as passive, receptive, dead, or inert. Where ancient views of nature are linked with the nurturing feminine, they conveyed an ethical restraint on human extractive and exploitative endeavors with the other than human world. But as nature becomes mechanized, it is rendered passive or inert, and ethical restraints of the human destructive activities of nature are also removed, while at the same time feminized humans become subject to intensified external control in the form of witch trials, colonialism, and early capitalism. In a similar vein, proponents of critical theory, like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, and others have diagnosed a sense that the disease at the heart of modernity is rooted in a link between autonomous reason and the domination of nature, and that once those are yoked, the domination of humanity is the next logical extension. More recently, the sense of social and environmental degradation linked to a loss of meaning, sacrality, or enchantment is explicitly articulated by certain proponents of new materialism, like Jane Bennett. In the text preceding her famous new materialist text, Vibrant Matter, Bennett frames the condition of modernity as disenchanted, concisely summarizing the views articulated by others from Sittler to Merchant to critical theory. In The Enchantment of Modern Life, Bennett makes the case for the importance of a kind of re-enchantment by portraying the modern condition as disenchanted. She writes, "There was once a time when nature was purposive. God was active in the details of human affairs. Human and other creatures were defined by a pre-existing web of relations. Social life was characterized by face-to-face relations, and political order took the form of organic community. When this pre-modern world gave way to forces of scientific and instrumental rationality, secularism, individualism, and the bureaucratic state, all of which combined disenchanted the world." Bennett's antidote to this situation is echoed beyond the new materialisms to broader projects to reinstill wonder, enchantment, re-enchant, or re-sacralize the world. This project is widely characteristic of recent trends in the field of religion and environment. From Alistair McGrath's The Re-Enchantment of Nature, to Mary Evelyn Tucker's Worldly Wonder, to Mark Wallace's exploration of Christian animisms in When God Was a Bird, to David Ray Griffin's Re-Enchantment Without Supernaturalism. Mary Evelyn Tucker, for example, writes in Worldly Wonder that, quote, "Religions have traditionally been a means of expanding the measure of the mind through the power of the religious imagination. Now is the moment for the religions to move forward boldly with comprehensive narrative perspectives that are grounded in relevant traditional resources, open to a sense of wonder, and guided by inspiring moral visions for shaping human-earth relations for a sustainable future." Informed by Thomas Berry, Tucker's approach aims to apply the resources of religions for shifts in value, perspective, and morality. Rather than religion opposed to science, Tucker emphasizes the role of religion in concert with a similarly re-enchanted science. While Tucker emphasizes the importance of religion for re-enchanting nature in conversation with the sciences, other influential figures in the sciences like Richard Dawkins and Carl Sagan argue that there is no need for external efforts of religions to re-enchant. Indeed, the sciences provide access to real wonder where religions have had to make it up. As Sagan argued in Contact, quote, "We all have a thirst for wonder. It's a deeply human quality. Science and religion are both bound up with it. What I'm saying is, you don't have to make stories up. You don't have to exaggerate. There's wonder and awe enough in the real world. Nature's a lot better at inventing wonders than we are," end quote. Such emphases on re-enchantment, whether they are explicitly drawing from religions or, like Sagan, Dawkins, and Bennett, arguing for a kind of re-enchantment that functions regardless or in an antithesis to religion, they're all consistently tied to ethical claims. For example, in making the case for a new understanding of matter as vibrant, vital, and animate rather than dead and inert, Jane Bennett argues for the need to feel awe and wonder in order to bridge a gap between ethical norms and ethical practice. Too often, she emphasizes, we know what we should do, our ethical norms are in place, but we fail to act on them. So to bridge this gap between knowing the right thing and doing the right thing, we need affects like wonder and enchantment. These affects affirm a sense of loving life, of saying yes to the world, and thus provoke a profound sense of attachment to the world that can propel the action our normative ethical claims tell us we should take. This focus on enchantment in modern life then leads Bennett to her next project, published as Vibrant Matter, in which she aims to theorize vibrant activity, animacy, and vitality of matter that the mechanized modernity has rendered dead. This text has been instrumental then in initiating a turn toward reanimating matter in a broad and diverse set of works of the new materialisms. So the predominant lens through which many scholars of different disciplines have approached the question of environmental destructions has been disenchantment, a loss of agency and enchantment in the sacred and the natural world. In the context of a predominant focus on re-enchantment, on account of a sense of profound disenchantment leading to environmental and social domination, religion scholar Jason Josephson Storm's book, The Myth of Disenchantment, comes as something of a shock. In this book, Storm emphasizes what I have been outlining, that one of the most common assumptions about modernity is that what it means to be modern is that, quote, magic and spirits had to go if the world was to be amenable to systematic and rational interpretation. Storm calls this predominant narrative into question, building from Deepesh Chakrabarty's work on provincializing the relationship between religion and science. Chakrabarty has demonstrated the ways that universalizing claims of both religion and science have been used to reinforce imperial aims. While the Euro-American context is widely portrayed as secularized and disenchanted, Asian, African, and Latin American contexts are commonly seen in modernity as mystical, spiritual, still enchanted, and either admirably or backwardly resistant to the march of scientific capitalist rationalism. Such narratives have justified colonial imperial aims and continue to function in the coloniality of globalized capitalism. In spite of the persistence of what Storm calls the, quote, single most familiar story in the history of science, he methodically and persuasively demonstrates that disenchantment, inasmuch as it is associated with the project of rationalization, desacralization, and demythologization, has never been completed, even and especially in the Euro-American context. Storm cites a preponderance of empirical studies demonstrating that although the Euro-American context has seen a decline in organized religion, this does not mean its people are less enchanted. Indeed, even in studies on people who gain a university education or enter the sciences, it's not so much that people become disenchanted as they trade one form of enchantment for another. For example, a university education, according to these studies, does decrease the chance that one will remain part of an organized religion, but it increases the chance that one will believe in UFOs or paranormal phenomena. Even from its beginnings, modern science was not promoted in conflict with various enchantments. Francis Bacon, for example, explicitly framed modern science in terms of the Christian salvation narrative, and elsewhere portrays it as a kind of purified magic. Isaac Newton articulated his new physics in terms that presumed and seemed to prove divine presence and the necessity of an omnipotent power for the maintenance of mechanistic cosmos. Indeed, the modern mechanists were predominantly not arguing for a mechanized world in order to promote irreligion, but in fact to support their view of an omnipotent divinity that was not swayed by the contingencies of the natural world. In terms of Max Weber, Storm emphasizes that Max Weber and others who promoted the idea of disenchantment were compelled by their pronouncements of a disenchanted world to pursue new enchantments. Citing archival and previously under-acknowledged sources, Storm argues that Weber in fact developed much of his ideas of a disenchanted world from a remote community that had sprung up around the promotion of new occult worldviews. Storm points out that one cannot simultaneously argue for disenchantment and mourn it as Weber does, since one's mournings reinstates what one has mourned in the same gesture. And this points to an important and often overlooked distinction, one that Storm doesn't emphasize, but I think is important to clarify. Disenchantment should not be conflated with the recognition of colonial or settler colonial violence if the eradication of lifeways was pursued in order to replace them with colonial Christianity. The eradication of indigenous lifeways and animisms could hardly be called disenchantment if the aim was to replace them with another religion. Consequently, rather than conflict between religion, science, and magic, Storm theorizes a more dialectical relationship. One should not be surprised, he writes, to find that, quote, reason does not eliminate superstition, but piggybacks upon it. That mechanisms often produce vitalism, and that often in a single room we can find both seance and science. Rather than a void of meaning or absence of enchantment or wonder, Storm's work asks us to attend to the interdependent linkages of reason and myth, the ways that affects of wonder produce reasoned ethics, how rationalizing tendencies of science and early capitalism produced new forms of religion and spirituality, and how mechanistic practices can be enticed through vitalisms. This critical focus on ongoing and enduring enchantments, and tending to the ways enchantment and disenchantment have more often than not played off, produced, and enticed and provoked, rather than eradicating one another, is particularly important in helping to illuminate, rather than obscure or marginalize, critical reflection on energy and extraction. In attending in particular to energy and extraction practices, I've found that while elements of the disenchantment thesis do ring true, these practices, energy and extraction practices in particular, were profoundly enchanted. And if the primary lens through which philosophy of religion and environment has been interpreting the environmental crisis is through a loss of enchantment, then those places where environmental practices have remained profoundly enchanted get looked over and lost. In the 19th century US context, early oilmen were enchanted by oil. They were enticed by a sense of wonder and even divine presence in the world to extract oil. What we see here is not a lack of meaning, but an overflow of religious spiritual meaning onto oil extraction. For example, 19th century spiritualisms like harmonialism were widely popular movements. Influential, highly educated members of US culture at the time, like Abraham Lincoln, were adherents of harmonialism. As historian Rochelle Ranieri-Zuck notes in her research on US Christian spiritualism and oil, spiritualists increasingly turned to the oil industry not primarily because of its lucrative financial opportunities, but because of its, quote, potential to demonstrate the practical applications of spiritualism. A group of Christian spiritualists, for instance, created the Chicago Rock Oil Company not just for material gains, but because they hoped that oil itself could, quote, function as a kind of medium to persuade non-believers that spiritualism could make practical contributions to modern life. Here again, it is enchantment with oil, but also the potential role oil could play to entice people over to a religious worldview rather than a disenchanting mechanistic worldview that proved enticing. Along these lines, where oil was seen as something that could mediate between spirit and matter, oil mediums like Abraham James employed spiritualist techniques to predict where to find oil. In many and various ways, electricity and magnetism proved appealing primarily because they could seemingly demonstrate the fundamental inadequacy of reductive materialisms that would suggest that matter is dead. Something very similar emerged when I looked into the beginnings of modern mining and the Saxony mining boom. This took place in the 1500s, the precise geographical and temporal context of the Protestant Reformation. Johann Matthias lived in Joachimsthal, in current-day Czech Republic on the border with Germany. And he witnessed the rapid changes brought about by mining. A successful mining venture allowed him the opportunity to travel to Wittenberg to be trained and ordained by Martin Luther himself as a pastor, and then he was sent back by Luther and the Reformers to Joachimsthal in 1545 as a pastor to the miners. It was in this context that he wrote a collection of sermons to miners, Seripta oder Bergpostil, or Sermons on the Mount, where Matthias portrayed mining and the Protestant event as wholly intertwined with God's providential aims for the world. Matthias believed in the organic development of minerals. Like plants and animals, they were theorized to develop from one form to their fully perfected form over time with the application of heat. God planted minerals as seeds from the beginning of time, leaving them to come to their full development at the divinely appointed moment. Matthias believed he was clearly living in a divinely appointed moment. Just as underdeveloped minerals sat in the earth being perfected over time, so too the gospel message had been proclaimed, then was buried, lay in wait, being perfected over time, only to emerge when the reformers mined it and brought it to the light of day. The correspondence of the mining boom and the Reformation were not happenstance for Matthias. Their simultaneity revealed a providential plan. Both the mining boom and the Protestant Reformation together served as evidence to Matthias that he was living in a time when God's influence was strongest, when the divine plan was finally coming to fruition. The sense of minerals as lively and organic, growing over time until their fully developed form, was also the case across the world only a couple decades later in the newly colonized Americas. Early texts legitimizing the colonization of the Americas for the purposes of extracting mineral wealth didn't do so on the grounds of dead and inert minerals, but made the arguments on the grounds that the minerals were organic, animate, and alive. In scholastic thought, informing mineralogies and legal justifications, the natural world was seen as growing and organic. The orderliness of the natural world, from mineral to vegetal to human, was dependent on a principle of subordination of imperfect matter to perfect form and means to the proper ends. The 16th century debates about Spanish colonization, mineral rights, and enslavement of indigenous Americans all relied on and assumed this ontological framing. Just as the raw matter of minerals was identified as imperfect matter in need of perfection that would be found in their extraction and refinement, so too indigenous Americans were not dead or inert matter, purely lacking humanity, but unruly, imperfect matter, unformed humans, which were rendered all the more malleable for their liveliness, and so in need of the perfecting agency of Spanish rule, Christian religion, and forced labor. If disenchantment is the only lens through which we can see and analyze environmental destruction, then sites of enduring enchantment and their ethical, environmental, and social effects will remain obscured. In the ways extractive and other economic practices have not just been justified by religious ideology, but conversely have sometimes functioned to extend the boundaries of a religion or what counts as a religion, that will remain similarly in the shadows. A sole focus on disenchantment narratives has other consequential effects as well. In dominion debates, domination is consistently linked to a spiritual void and a need to fill that void. This leads to a focus on consumer cultures interpreted as morally vacuous and driven by a need to fill that void with consumer behaviors. This has meant that the vast majority of religion and environmental discourses have focused on consumption as the needed lever of change, leaving production off the hook. This turns systemic, institutional, and corporate-driven problems into problems of individual morality. Analyzing enduring enchantments, the ways that energy and extraction are imbued with a sense of theological, religious, or moral meaning can help us make a shift from an individual focus on consumption patterns to focus on analysis and critique of production. In light of these examples and problems with a primary focus on disenchantment, I think it's time for a dramatic shift in starting points and methods for philosophies of religion and environment. Rather than starting with disenchantment or with dominion or disenchantment or re-enchantment, we need to start thinking religion and environment from the starting places of extractive zones. In addition to assuming a disenchantment narrative, philosophy of religion and environment has also assumed religion as a given. Informed especially by the groundbreaking work of Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, religion and environmental discourses have been organized around established religions. In 1996, Tucker and Grimm launched the Project on Religion and Ecology at Harvard University's Center for the Study of World Religions. The project organized a set of 10 conferences, each focusing on a major world religion and ecology. Each conference, from Christianity and ecology to Judaism and ecology, Confucianism and ecology, Jainism and ecology, etc., resulted in an edited volume that was added to a book series started by Grimm and Tucker as well. The world religions focus of these conferences and books has influenced the predominant approach of religion and environmental discourses for the past couple decades. More recently, Ron Taylor and others have begun to challenge this world religion focus. Taylor, for example, has focused on what he calls dark green religions, or spiritual practices holding nature as sacred, emerging out of environmental activist movements and communities. Taylor examines the views and practices of a wide range of environmental groups, many which reject religious and supernatural worldviews, but nonetheless articulate spiritual motivations for their activism. Rather than focus on established institutional religions, Taylor encourages us to look at ways the environmental activists and their movements are often displaying characteristics of religion redefined, all of which are obscured by a purely world religions approach. I think Taylor is on to something important, but I think that starting from historical and ongoing extractive zones presses the question of religion and what counts as religion even further. Most philosophy of religion and environmental approaches, especially Grimm and Tucker's world religion approach, but Taylor's to an extent as well, take the concept of religion as a given. I would argue that the concept of religion itself needs to be problematized and theorized as an idea produced out of the extractive zones of colonial modernity. The modern study of religion has its roots in concepts and texts that differentiate between fully developed monotheisms and primitive, underdeveloped animisms. The fetish, in particular, emerges as a key example of something identified with primitive religion that was seen as an impediment of the ability of a group to make rational economic decisions about the value of matter. The concept of the fetish emerged first in the 16th century texts written on the Gold Coast of Africa when Portuguese merchants encountered West African peoples. In the extractive zone of the West African Gold Coast, the fetish, theorized as a religiously induced mistake in economic valuing, the concept of the fetish was born, and from there, Enlightenment thinkers would take up the concept and think about the ways that people value matter, the relationship between rational economic valuing and religious beliefs, and a theory of human moral and intellectual development that could be traced according to a continuum of religions stretching from primitive animists to fully rational Christian monotheists. These are the roots, not just of environmentally destructive and socially unjust extractive practices, but of modern religion. Given the rootedness of the vast majority of current environmental degradation in extractive practices, and the rootedness of the modern concept of religion in extractive zones, I suggest this is the needed starting point for the next generation of philosophers of religion and environment. From this perspective, the common refrain within religion and environment discourses of resourcing religions, of mining religions for the resources that they can offer the world in environmental crisis, will evidently need to be problematized. Instead, we would attend to material practices of extraction and the play of enchantment and disenchantment that infuse both the justification of these practices and resistance to them. But we would also need to attend to practices of epistemological extraction, a mining of peoples, rituals, ceremonies, and belief, where ancient, indigenous, or otherwise racialized peoples become tools to think with, just as lives, lifeways, and situated wisdom gets metabolized into environmental solutions. Theorizing religion and environment from the extractive zone means recognizing the intertwinement of social and environmental justice as a starting point. As I suggested in my introduction, environmental philosophy and environmental justice have generally remained distinct. It is increasingly being acknowledged that phenomena like climate change have severe social justice implications that affect those who have least contributed and have least resources to deal with it. But social issues of racism and coloniality are still generally approached as an alternative concern or a derivative consequence of the more primary concern of environmental destruction. By viewing these issues from the starting standpoint of the extractive zone, we see the radical entwinement and the need to think together issues of social and environmental injustice. Given the kinds of perspectives and modes of analysis that have been overlooked and obscured in predominant streams of philosophy of religion and environment, there's a pressing need for new approaches. It's high time we start theorizing religion and environment from the starting point of extractive zones. Do we have time for some questions?
We do. We have more than enough time, so if you've got questions, just go ahead and, would you mind if I let you
Moderate
your own? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, would you mind sharing your name?
Ray,
Yeah.
Forgive me my ignorance. Can you define extractive zone for me?
Yeah, it just means practices, generally practices of taking something, material that gets identified as resource out of the earth. So taking something from its kind of organic, intertwined, original context and removing it for commercial use. Yeah. So think oil, think mining. Yeah, these are extractive zones. Yeah,
Thank you
your
so
name,
much.
please.
Yeah, sorry, Jared Stewart. So thank you so much for coming. This is awesome. So I teach government here. Number one, if you've seen one Ronald Reagan act in performance, you've seen them all. So you throw him under the bus. It's fine. He's not going to be pissed about it. So you said the bureaucratic state leads to disenchantment of the world. I love that. I was curious because in the last paper you talked about this intertwining between social and environmental justice, and I've seen a lot of studies that show that like Superfund cleanup sites predominantly near communities of color. So I wonder, could you speak a little bit to what seemed like the intentionality of policymakers to target those communities with those? Because I think it wasn't by accident, right, that those sites were so close to those communities.
Yeah, this is what the UCC study found, right? They looked at a range of other factors that could have contributed to why These toxic locations were predominantly placed closer to minority neighborhoods. They compared to, they took into account economics, they took into account other factors like education and class and things like that. Taking all of that into account, still race was the predominant factor. And so yeah, I mean, I think that that a lot of that has to do with the kind of voice that people have in the political sphere, kind of, and that has to do with histories of disenfranchisement in government and in politics for people to have that kind of a voice, to have a say. You know, these practices could have, and many of them were kind of first proposed to be next to predominantly white neighborhoods, but it was really those neighborhoods speaking up and saying, no, we're not going to put that in my backyard, right? So then they get moved to a place where there's not that kind of voice, there's not that kind of political weight that would really pose a threat. Yeah, Maya.
Which, this is very interesting, I love all of it. I'm really sad I can't be here tomorrow for your other talk, because I can go through it as well. But I was just thinking too, when you talk about extractive zones, I don't know if you think that potentially there could be an association where if there is an issue with disenchantment, which means we potentially then become disenchanted with ourselves, which then leads to more hatred and moments where systems can be oppressive. Can then extractive zones mean that what is defined as material could then be human beings?
Yeah, well, yeah, and this is the argument that critical theorists will make, right? That that when the material world and nature becomes disenchantment, then the next logical step is to disenchant humanity and to devalue humanity, to turn humanity into the machines that we have made of the natural world, right? So yeah, that's the argument of critical theorists, and I think, like I said, I think that those arguments still hold. There's still important insights from them. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that if that's the only lens that we're going to kind of look at these issues from, then we're going to miss the ways that that enchantment or re-enchantment isn't always or hasn't always been a solution, but sometimes it's something that has driven our anti-environmental practices as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's something, I'm not trying to say that the disenchantment narrative is completely false. I think that that's still relevant, it's still holding important weight and important claims. I think we just need to not always so quickly assume that re-enchantment is going to be the necessary antidote, right? If re-enchantment is always going to be the necessary antidote, then we miss the ways that that enchantment might be precisely part of the problem in some of those instances. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So would, I guess I've heard recently, and I may not be using the right terminology, but this sort of like pan-vitalism, or the idea that matter is suffused with consciousness, is that an example of re-enchantment, of trying to do that?
Yeah, so there, that's, pan-vitalism or new materialism is slightly different from, a new materialism is not saying that there's a kind of consciousness or kind of spirit within matter, but that matter itself has a kind of agency to it that is sometimes self-organizing. So think of complexity theory or chaos theory. These theories of matter, things, even things that are inorganic, right, ordering themselves. So think of like a whirlpool that, where you have just kind of a big disturbance of water. How does that water, that's not a living thing, so certainly doesn't have like consciousness or rationality within it, but how does that disturbance in water sometimes emerge, out of that emerges a kind of orderliness into a whirlpool, right? So these are theories of the ways, how to account for the ways that matter itself seems to sometimes self-organize without any kind of given blueprint or a leader or a designer to it. So yeah, that's there are the vitalisms, and then new materialism is trying to distance itself from the older vitalisms that would say there's some kind of spirit, or there's some kind of consciousness, or some kind of like lower level of life within matter. And the new materialists are saying we don't need to say that. There are ways that matter itself is self-organizing. Is that making sense? Yeah. So I do. Yeah, I see that. But despite those differences, I see both of those as enchantment moves, right? Both of them are trying to, especially in the ways that they are tying that to an ethical claim, that seeing matter as lively will lead to a more environmental ethic, or lead to a stronger sense of care. I think they're both making enchantment kind of claims. Yeah, remind me of your name.
Brad.
Yeah.
Hope this is a fair question, but obviously the word religion is notoriously difficult to define.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought it kind of fit the example of Wittgenstein's, family resemblance
Mm-hmm.
kind of way of defining a term, because it's hard to pin one down.
Yeah.
But most philosophers of religion tend to have a working definition for religion, or a favorite version.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular version that or definition that you like, or that you use, or that maybe is critical to this? Does maybe another way to say it, does enchantment require some sort of supernatural, or is there another way to think about religion that maybe defers more to the Sagan and Dawkins view?
Yeah. So first I would say that the term religion, right, is ancient. It's religio. It's to tie oneself, or to tie back. That comes from ancient Latin. So I'm not claiming that is a new term, but the claim is one that's common in kind of critical religious studies today, is to look at the ways that the characteristics of what many of us identify as religion today, as a kind of sacred and as opposed to profane, as something that's interior or personal rather than public. Right? These are all characteristics that many of us kind of assume with what we mean by religion. But scholars of religion are really emphasizing the ways that that's a modern phenomenon, right? That emerged in modernity. That's not characteristic of ancient Christianity, let alone a wide range of other traditions that we would want to call religious. And so in terms of I haven't worked out yet how I would articulate a understanding or definition of religion in terms of an extractive zone. Right now, my focus has been kind of looking at that historical trajectory, right? How has what counts as religion changed? How has the definition of religion changed, and what is not religion? How religion gets posed against science or against kind of economic things, but also seems to be infusing those economic practices, or infusing a sense of a pursuit of science, right? It's those kind of slippages between the assumed modern boundaries of religion that I'm really interested in, right? I'm really interested in those places where what's happening and seems to be identified as secular actually is looking very religious, right? So even scholars like, or even folks like Dawkins and Sagan, right? They have that really reductive understanding of religion in conversation with science. You know, we don't need to make up stories, but critical religion scholars today, like Lisa Sedaris, have analyzed the way that they understand science. And Lisa Sedaris has this great book called Consecrating Science. So looks at the ways that they're framing science in characteristics that look very much like religion, right? So, so even for those folks, that boundary, or there's a lot of slippage there. There's not these like neatly defined. So I haven't. I'm much more interested in that slippage than kind of neatly repackaging what I would consider religion at the moment, at least. Yeah. Do you have a sense?
You
What-
mean
Yeah, I mean,
a way of defining?
Yeah. Yeah. Like what would work?
I tend to think of it generally as any attempt to identify, explain, solve the problem of evil in the world.
Okay.
That's kind of a general working definition of my own, one that I came up with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just another kind of question, more of a statement that probably has no answer, like most things do. But where do you think, since humanity seems to have an innate hunger for belief or like faith in something, whatever that is, because we seem to at least always be driven, at least my interpretation, by some sort of enchantment or wanting to find some sort of enchantment, whether that be science or money or however religion. How do you kind of think about that or view it?
Yeah. So this was the struggle that I had in writing the book that I'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow. But this was the struggle that I had with this enchantment, disenchantment kind of discourse, right? Like the typical kind of the typical materialist move would be to say this thing that that looks secular but as actually functioning as a religion, we really need to rationalize it and demythologize it, right? But I'm with you, Maya, and I think that I think we are always going to be. We need myth, we need narrative, so we're always going to be producing it, right? And so I don't think that, for me, that move to say, if something like petroleum is functioning like a religion, we just need to more rationally understand it and just demythologize it. I think that that's just not a very honest approach of the way that human beings are always going to need to be making meaning out of something and have and lead meaningful lives. And so I think that that's why I've shifted toward not saying that disenchantment is not the case and not saying we need to re-enchant, but we need to attend to that play between enchantment and disenchantment and think critically about how those materialize in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily to just disenchant them, but to think critically about how they are materializing, and still say like we can have our myth and we can have our meaning making. Those aren't, from my perspective, they're not false consciousness. Right? It's not a kind of false consciousness. But we do need to attend critically to how they materialize in the world, the kinds of worlds that they create.
Yeah, 'cause that's an issue that I seem to have a lot of time with philosophical conversation I have in general, where there's a very innate need. For some reason, we want rationality, we want clear-cut boxes that helps us maintain this life and kind of rationalize why things go on the way they do. But we also don't flourish necessarily in that environment. We need to have the other, and we're naturally drawn to the other. So it's like finding a balance, and then being like, okay, collectively, let's try to do the balance is like the hard part.
Yeah, well, and I like to remind students that, like, oftentimes the ancients, like, they just, this wasn't so much of an issue for them. It wasn't a scandal, right? Like Plato, in his famous text, the Timaeus, where he's theorizing the beginnings of the world, he's also, like, he's explicitly saying, I'm mythologizing, right? I'm doing philosophy, I'm doing, this is a rational pursuit, but I'm also creating myth, and he's, like, explicitly saying that together, right? So I think that has been the case through much of history. It's just, in modernity, we've gotten this sense that you're either doing myth or you're doing rationality. And I think that we need to be thinking about them as piggybacking on one another, and not just calling that a day and saying, oh, look, we fixed it, but, like, attending more closely to that piggybacking in the ways that it's materialized in the world. Yeah, Sue.
Yes, I'm very interested in the example of the fetish, and I'm just wondering if that relates to this analyzing or mining or resourcing of religions. Is that like fetishizing religions in a way? Is that kind of the connection that you're making?
Well, I think that there would be some of my religion colleagues who would say that. What I am trying to emphasize with the fetish is, I think that the fetish is an inherently problematic term that has racializing and colonial history that continues to racialize, right? So I think that the fetish has continued in practices like in the context of Arabia when oil was first discovered. There were Christian missionaries there at the time, and they wrote back to the US and articulated this concern that this very valuable resource was found there, and their concern was that was not with a lack of science, but with the ways that Islam was a religion that couldn't properly make economic decisions, right? And so Christianity was needed. Christian missionaries and Christian oil companies were needed because Christianity provided the kind of rationality that could make not just good religious decisions, but good economic decisions, right? And I think the same thing happens with, you all have seen Killers of the Flower Moon, right? I think that same kind of logic, this is up in Oklahoma in the 1920s. The Osage people were the wealthiest group of people in the world because oil was discovered on the land that they had been moved to a reservation, and what happened was that as they got more and more wealthy, this system of guardianship was placed on the Osage people. What the film doesn't mention, it was also guardianship was also placed on African Americans in Oklahoma as well who were discovering oil. But the same idea holds, that this is a group of people, because of their religious persuasions, can't properly make economic decisions around this very precious resource, right? I think that's the history, that's the legacy of the fetish, right? Rather than, and I think that continues in, so I'm trying to rethink the fetish rather than Marx and Freud, right? They became kind of the famous ones for thinking the fetish, the commodity fetish and things like that into modernity. But I'm trying to reframe that and look at the ways that that's a concept that I think continues to produce logics that distinguish between races and between religions and their kind of the economic decisions that they can make.
I know you do a lot of work with petroculture. I have a few questions about like extractivistic zones in terms of renewable energy. So I'm going to pose 4 examples, and can you let me know if like you would consider them extractive zones? Solar farms, wind farms, industrial cattle farms, and then regenerative cattle farms.
Yeah. So I'll talk about this a little bit more next time, but I think that the key is that different renewable energy, what we oftentimes don't account for are, like people say, we have solar panels and that we can just like have unlimited energy, right? But the problem, like the materials from the solar panels still have to come from somewhere, right? And increasingly the batteries for our e-vehicles and solar panels are being extracted in the same extractive practices, even the same companies, right? Like Chevron now has a whole web page on their webpage. It's not just about extracting oil, but they have a whole branch of extracting lithium for lithium mining and for EV batteries and things like that. So it's oftentimes even the same companies, right, doing the same kind of practices. So I think that we really need to attend not to just like the outcomes, not just to what the technology is, but ask those kind of questions of how has that been produced, and then what are the ways that that energy, what does that do to social and political power, right? So other examples are in Morocco, this kind of huge solar array was created, and Karen Rignall is a petroculture studies scholar who has done this fascinating study of this huge solar array in Morocco. And what she demonstrates is that those solar arrays displaced indigenous populations in Morocco, and that energy is not being produced for local people who are in energy poverty, but it's being shipped to Europe, right? And so she demonstrates that it's the same kind of colonial mechanisms, the same kind of colonial practices that are happening sometimes around those new forms of new alternative energies. And so many of the petroculture scholars would say it's just a petroculture in a new form, right? That's to say though, right? That's not to say that all alternative energy forms need to function like that. But I think what I and other petroculture studies scholars are wanting to emphasize is that that we need to attend not just to how much energy or that energy is being produced, but how is that affecting social and political power, right? Is the social and political power continuing to be consolidated around certain corporations and political entities, or is it being democratically distributed? And by contrast to the Moroccan solar panel example, you can look at other examples of cooperative solar panel endeavors where that social and political and economic power is being distributed rather than consolidated, right? So it's not attending so much to just replacing solar panels or wind or something like that, but what is that doing to the social and political power? And what are the ways that it's either reinforcing the petro themes of consolidating power, or by contrast, redistributing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, I believe we're going to need to end it there. So let's thank Dr. Rowe again.